The night in Saint Tropez did not look like a finale. No photographers camped outside the gates. No television vans. No last wave from a balcony. No scripted farewell for the world to replay. Inside La Madrigue, the house that became both sanctuary and fortress, Brigitte Bardot was reaching the end of a life that had once seemed too loud, too bright, too untamable to ever be contained by silence. When dawn arrived on Sunday, December 28th, 2025, the confirmation did not come with spectacle, only with the blunt weight of fact. Bardot had died at 91, her passing announced by the foundation that had carried her name in her second life's mission. In a matter of minutes, France did what it always does when a national myth disappears. It paused, then it argued, then it remembered. Headlines pulled out the same images as if trying to freeze time. The young face with the defiant gaze, the hair that became a global signature, the posture of a woman who looked like she had been born to scandalize an era that demanded obedience. But behind the recycled photographs was an uncomfortable truth the cameras could not capture. The last hours were not public property. There were no verified intimate details released to satisfy a modern appetite for endings. What the world received was the outline, not the scene itself. She died at home in Saint Tropez, after decades of retreat, and what followed would be a private funeral, with the town preparing a public tribute in its historic heart. As if the village itself needed to say goodbye on behalf of everyone who could never cross that gate. And then, almost instantly, the second narrative arrived, the one that always waits in the shadows of legends. The question of what, exactly, we are mourning. A star, a symbol of sexual liberation. A French cultural export who rewrote the language of desire in the 1950s and 1960s. An activist who walked away from cinema early and poured her remaining decades into animal welfare with an intensity that made admirers devotionally loyal and critics uncompromisingly harsh. Even the official tributes carried that duality. The French president described her as a symbol of freedom and a legend of the century, a phrase that sounds like closure until you remember how often freedom, in her story, was paid for with isolation. Because Bardot's ending was never going to be simple, not after a life built on contradiction. She was celebrated for breaking molds and condemned for refusing to be molded again later. She was turned into an icon before she had the chance to be ordinary, and then she fought for the right to disappear, not gently, but absolutely. That disappearance, the long self-imposed exile from the industry that made her, is the key to why the final hours feel so unsettling to people who never met her. The public wants a last scene to match the myth, but her life's late logic rejected myths. In recent months, any signal from her world had been scarce, and the little that did surface was about the boundaries she kept rebuilding. There had even been a moment earlier in 2025 when she publicly rejected false rumors about her death, a surreal rehearsal that exposed how quickly the internet consumes a person's mortality before it arrives. That episode matters now because it reveals something darker than gossip, a culture that demands ownership of a legend's body and timeline, treating the end as content to be claimed, corrected, monetized, and debated. So when the real news landed, it hit like a hard cut, not because the world had never imagined her dying, but because it had been playing with that idea too casually. The silence around her final night became, paradoxically, the loudest detail. It forced a confrontation with the one thing fame can never control, the moment when the audience is no longer invited in. What we can say with confidence is what reputable reporting has laid out. She died at 91 in Saint Tropez. She had lived her later years there, largely out of sight. She would be laid to rest near the sea, with arrangements that keep the core farewell private, and a broader public remembrance anchored to the place that helped build her myth. Everything else, the whispered images people want to imagine, the supposed last words, the exact faces in the room, belongs to speculation, and Bardot's story demands that we resist that temptation because she spent decades resisting us. That is where the real tension begins, not in the medical specifics, but in the emotional geometry of her life. How does a woman become the world's fantasy and then choose to live behind locked doors, surrounded by animals, not applause? How does a nation mourn someone it both adored and fought with? How does a myth end when the person behind it refuses to perform the ending? Tonight, we start where the world always starts too late, at the final silence, and then we trace backward through the storms that led to it, until the legend becomes human again. Before Brigitte Bardot became a name that could stop an entire country mid-sentence, before her image crossed oceans and unsettled moral codes, there was a child who learned very early that love and discipline were not the same thing. She was born in Paris in 1934, into a family that valued order, reputation, and restraint above emotional expression. Affection was not absent, but it was tightly controlled, filtered through rules and expectations that left little room for softness. In later years, Bardot would describe her childhood not as overtly cruel, but as emotionally distant, a place where silence often spoke louder than words. That silence shaped her long before fame ever did. From an early age, her parents pushed her toward ballet, believing it would instill discipline and refinement. The dance studio became her first refuge, a place where the body could speak when the voice could not. Ballet offered structure, repetition, and a form of beauty that felt earned rather than imposed. Yet even there, something about her stood out. Teachers noticed not just technical skill, but an intensity that did not quite fit the traditional mold. She was expressive in ways that could not be fully contained by choreography. The same quality that would later unsettle audiences was already present, waiting for a different stage. That stage arrived almost accidentally. As a teenager, Bardot began modeling, and soon the camera discovered her. Or perhaps more accurately, she discovered the camera. There was an ease, an untrained honesty in how she moved and looked back at the lens. She did not perform innocence the way young actresses were expected to. She did not hide her physical presence. In a post-war France, still clinging to restraint and moral rebuilding, that alone was a quiet provocation. When she entered cinema, the impact was immediate and disorienting. Bardot did not act like her contemporaries. She did not soften herself to be palatable. On screen, she appeared raw, instinctive, sometimes awkward, but undeniably alive. The release of and God-created woman transformed her almost overnight into an international phenomenon. The film did more than launch a career. It detonated an image. Bardot became the embodiment of a new kind of femininity, one that did not apologize for desire, one that unsettled censors and fascinated audiences in equal measure. What is often forgotten is how young she was when this happened, and how little protection existed around her. Fame arrived without instruction, without emotional armor. Her image was reproduced endlessly, dissected, argued over. She became less a person than a symbol, a projection of fantasies and fears. Fashion followed her. Politics reacted to her. Morality debated her. And while the world argued about what she represented, Bardot herself was still trying to understand who she was allowed to be. The pressure was relentless. Every relationship became public property. Every marriage turned into spectacle. Her body, her choices, her moods were analyzed as if they belonged to everyone except her. Interviews from later in her life reveal how deeply invasive this period felt. She spoke of exhaustion, of feeling watched even in solitude, of the creeping sense that the version of herself the public loved was slowly replacing the real one. The applause did not feel like affirmation. It felt like confinement. The contradiction at the heart of her early fame was brutal. She was praised as a symbol of freedom, yet experienced her life as increasingly restricted. The more she represented liberation to others, the less free she felt herself. There were moments of profound distress, episodes of depression that were not widely understood at the time, and a growing desire to escape the role she had been assigned. Smiles on screen concealed a private discomfort that deepened with every new film. By the time she reached her late 30s, the gap between Brigitte Bardot, the icon, and Brigitte Bardot, the individual, had become unbearable. Each new project reinforced an identity she no longer recognized as her own. The industry expected her to continue, to age gracefully within the confines of desirability, to remain visible at all costs. Instead, she chose the unthinkable. She walked away. Her retirement from cinema was not a strategic pause or a dramatic farewell. It was abrupt, decisive, and deeply personal. At an age when many actresses fight harder than ever to remain relevant, Bardot closed the door completely. For the public, it was shocking. For her, it was survival. Yet leaving the spotlight did not mean leaving its consequences behind. The years of exposure had left scars that silence alone could not heal. She retreated to Saint Tropez, the place that had once amplified her myth and reshaped it into a refuge. There, away from film sets and premieres, she began to reconstruct a life on her own terms. The energy that had once fueled a global image found a new outlet, one that would redefine her later years entirely. Bardot turned her focus almost exclusively toward animal rights, a cause she pursued with the same intensity that had once driven her screen presence. This second life was no less controversial. Her activism was uncompromising, emotional, and often confrontational. She did not soften her language to maintain public favor. Lawsuits followed. Public opinion fractured again. Admirers praised her moral clarity. Critics accused her of extremism and intolerance. Once more, Bardot became a figure people argued about rather than listened to. And once more, she responded by withdrawing further. Understanding this trajectory is essential to understanding her final silence. The last hours in Saint Tropez did not emerge from nowhere. They were the logical conclusion of a life spent oscillating between exposure and retreat, between being seen too much and wanting not to be seen at all. Long before her death, Brigitte Bardot had been practicing disappearance, not as an act of defeat, but as a declaration of ownership over herself. In that light, the quiet ending does not feel tragic in the conventional sense. It feels consistent. A woman who never accepted imposed narratives refused one last time to give the world an ending it could package and consume. To understand her final silence, one must first understand how loudly the world spoke over her for so long. And that story, the one beneath the image, is where the myth begins to unravel into something far more human. By the time Brigitte Bardot retreated fully from cinema, the world believed it understood her. That belief was an illusion, carefully assembled from photographs, film frames, headlines, and moral debates. What followed her disappearance from the screen was not a peaceful epilogue, but a long and often misunderstood confrontation with the consequences of having been turned into an idea rather than allowed to remain a person. The silence she chose was not empty. It was heavy with unresolved tension, with anger, conviction, fatigue, and a need for control that fame had denied her for decades. Saint Tropez, once the playground where her image had crystallized into myth, became something else entirely. The parties faded. The crowds disappeared. The shutters closed. Bardot transformed her home into a protected interior world, one governed by her own rules. Animals replaced people. Routine replaced spectacle. The same intensity that once electrified cinema now fueled a singular mission: the defense of animals, pursued with a ferocity that surprised even those who thought they knew her well. This was not a rebranding exercise or a calculated attempt at legacy management. It was obsession in the purest sense. Bardot did not advocate politely. She condemned. She accused. She named names. Slaughterhouses, hunting traditions, governments, religious practices all became targets of her rage. To her supporters, this was moral clarity stripped of hypocrisy. To her critics, it was evidence that the former icon had become rigid, intolerant, and dangerously absolute in her worldview. The truth, as with most things in her life, sat uncomfortably between extremes. Bardot's activism was born from genuine empathy and a profound identification with vulnerability. Animals, unlike people, did not project expectations onto her. They did not demand performance. They did not interpret her past. In their presence, she could exist without history. But the language she used to defend them was often explosive, shaped by decades of resentment toward institutions and crowds that had consumed her without consent. Legal battles followed. Public condemnations accumulated. Courts fined her for inflammatory statements. Media outlets that once worshipped her now framed her as a problem. The same mechanism that had elevated her in youth now turned against her, extracting scandal from conviction. Bardot responded the only way she knew how, by closing him further. Interviews became rare, appearances nearly non-existent. Invitations to retrospectives, honors, and celebrations were refused. She did not want reconciliation with the industry that had defined her. She wanted distance. As the years passed, the contrast between past and present grew starker. The image frozen in collective memory remained young, luminous, provocative. The woman living behind the walls of La Madrigue aged quietly, surrounded by animals and paperwork related to her foundation. Visitors described her as lucid, sharp, unwavering in belief, but visibly tired. Not defeated, not softened, but worn by a life that had demanded total exposure and later total defense. Health rumors surfaced periodically, as they do with all aging public figures. Hospitalizations, surgeries, recoveries. Each report was met with minimal confirmation, often followed by renewed silence. Bardot did not correct narratives unless they crossed a boundary she found intolerable. When false reports of her death circulated earlier in her final year, she addressed them briefly, almost dryly, as if irritated less by the idea of dying than by the presumption that the world could rehearse it without her permission. That moment revealed something essential. Death, for Bardot, was not a performance to be staged in advance. It was a private certainty, not a public event. She had spent too much of her life being watched at moments she did not choose. The end, she seemed determined, would not belong to anyone else. The weeks leading up to her death unfolded without markers that the public could grasp. No farewell interviews. No symbolic reconciliations. No carefully worded reflections designed for posterity. Time narrowed. Life simplified. The days were measured not in plans or announcements, but in routines, care for animals, brief conversations, long stretches of quiet. Saint Tropez in the off-season mirrored her own withdrawal, stripped of spectacle, slowed to something almost unreal. What is striking about this period is not drama, but restraint. There are no verified accounts of emotional scenes or grand realizations. Those who were near her spoke later of calm rather than fear, of acceptance rather than regret. Bardot did not romanticize the past or seek absolution from the public. She did not attempt to rewrite her story into something more comfortable. The contradictions remained intact, unpolished. When the final day arrived, it did so without ceremony. No sirens, no immediate announcements, no crowd gathering at the gates. The world continued, unaware, while one of its most enduring symbols quietly exited it. Only later, when confirmation emerged, did the shock ripple outward. Not because the news itself was unexpected, but because the manner of it denied the culture of spectacle its final act. In the hours after her death became known, reactions unfolded in layers. First came reverence, then nostalgia, then argument. Images from a 1950s flooded screens. Film clips replayed endlessly. Quotes were recycled. Almost immediately, so were the controversies. Admirers emphasized her role in reshaping femininity and challenging post-war morality. Critics revisited her later statements and legal troubles. The pattern was familiar. Even in death, Bardot could not be reduced to a single narrative. Yet beneath the noise, another realization began to surface. Her ending was not a contradiction of her life, but its resolution. A woman who had spent decades fighting the gaze chose to leave without it. A person who had been transformed into an object reclaimed subjectivity through absence. The silence was not emptiness. It was authorship. Understanding this reframes the discomfort many felt. The public was denied closure because closure implies access. Bardot denied access consistently, especially at the end. In doing so, she forced a final confrontation with a question her life had posed from the beginning. What do we owe those we turn into symbols, and what do they owe us in return? Her final silence did not answer that question. It intensified it, and perhaps that is why her story does not settle neatly into mourning. It lingers unresolved, demanding reflection rather than applause. In the absence of a scripted goodbye, what remains is not a lesson wrapped in sentiment, but a life that insists on being viewed whole, with all its brilliance and abrasion intact. In the next part, the focus shifts outward, to the aftermath, the national reckoning, and the uneasy process of turning a human life back into history. The morning after the news broke, France entered a familiar but uneasy ritual. Television anchors lowered their voices. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Radio stations interrupted programming with solemn announcements. Yet beneath the surface of national mourning, something felt unsettled. Brigitte Bardot's death did not produce a single emotional register. It produced fracture. Admiration collided with discomfort. Nostalgia clashed with unresolved resentment. The country was not simply grieving a woman. It was confronting a mirror it had avoided for decades. For one generation, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Bardot had been youth itself. She was summer, rebellion, sensuality, and rupture. She represented the moment France stepped out of post-war rigidity and dared to imagine freedom in a new form. To them, her death felt like the disappearance of a personal memory, not a distant historical event. Old film clips resurfaced not as cultural artifacts, but as fragments of lived experience. Watching her again was like touching a vanished version of themselves. For others, especially younger audiences, the response was more conflicted. Bardot existed primarily as an image inherited through documentaries, books, and controversy. She was a legend with footnotes, a name surrounded by debates rather than discovery. Her later years, marked by polemical statements and legal consequences, loomed larger in their understanding than her cinematic impact. To them, mourning required negotiation. How do you honor artistic influence without ignoring harm? How do you separate the symbol from the positions she refused to retract? These tensions surfaced almost instantly in public discourse. Social media became a battlefield of memory. One post celebrated her as a pioneer of female autonomy. Another condemned her rhetoric and questioned the sincerity of institutional tributes. Neither side fully canceled the other. Instead, they coexisted in an uncomfortable simultaneity that revealed something deeper than disagreement. Bardot's life had always resisted consensus. Her death did not resolve that resistance. It exposed it. Institutions moved carefully. Official statements were measured. Language emphasized cultural impact, historical significance, and artistic contribution, while avoiding endorsement of everything she had said or believed. Plans for commemoration reflected the same restraint. There were no immediate grand state funerals, no sweeping declarations of unanimity. Saint Tropez announced a public tribute, but the core farewell remained private, in line with her wishes. Even in death, Bardot dictated the terms of engagement. This careful choreography underscored a central paradox. France wanted to claim her as a national icon, yet it spent years distancing itself from her most uncompromising positions. The country was forced to hold two truths at once. She had expanded the boundaries of representation and expression. She had also said things that many found unacceptable. Neither truth erased the other. The temptation to simplify was strong. The reality refused to cooperate. International reactions echoed this complexity, but with less intimacy. Abroad, Bardot was remembered primarily as a cinematic and cultural phenomenon. Her image had traveled farther than her politics. Obituaries focused on her influence on fashion, film, and global perceptions of French femininity. The controversies were mentioned, but softened by distance. What France experienced as an unresolved argument, the world often processed as a layered legacy. As days passed, the initial shock gave way to a slower, more reflective phase. Commentators revisited her decision to leave cinema at the height of fame. Analysts connected that choice to her final withdrawal from public life. Psychologists spoke about the cost of early idolization. Cultural historians framed her as both a product and a disruptor of her time. The conversation broadened, shifting from the specifics of her death to the patterns of her existence. What emerged was not clarity, but depth. Bardot was increasingly discussed not as a heroine or a villain, but as a case study in what happens when a human being is transformed into a symbol before they have the tools to defend themselves from that transformation. Her later rigidity, many argued, could be read as armor rather than malice. Her silence, not as indifference, but as boundary setting pushed to its extreme. This reframing did not absolve her. It contextualized her, and in doing so, it forced a more uncomfortable reckoning with the role of the audience. Bardot's life was not shaped in isolation. It was co-authored by desire, projection, judgment, and consumption. The same mechanisms that elevated her had later demanded her conformity, then punished her refusal. Her withdrawal exposed the transactional nature of fame in its rawest form. By the end of the first week, the noise began to fade. Headlines moved on. Debates cooled. What remained was quieter and more enduring. An awareness that Bardot's story could not be closed neatly. That her death did not deliver moral resolution or emotional catharsis. Instead, it left an open question suspended over cultural memory. Can a society acknowledge the totality of a life without reducing it to a slogan? In Saint Tropez, the sea continued its indifferent rhythm. Tourists paused at familiar locations. Flowers appeared and disappeared. The town absorbed the moment without transforming it into spectacle. That restraint felt intentional, almost instructive. Bardot had spent years insisting on distance. In death, she received it, imperfectly but sincerely. What followed was not a final verdict, but a transition. Brigitte Bardot was no longer a living subject capable of defiance or retreat. She was becoming history. And history, unlike celebrity, does not demand agreement. It demands examination. In the next part, the focus shifts to that longer horizon, to how myths harden into narratives, how contradictions are archived, and how a woman who refused easy answers continues to unsettle long after the silence settles. With the initial shock fading and the public arguments losing their urgency, Brigitte Bardot's presence began to shift from headline to reference, from breaking news to cultural memory. This is the phase where legacies are quietly reshaped, not by emotion, but by repetition. Film festivals revisited her work. Streaming platforms highlighted her most famous roles. Photographs long stripped of context circulated once again, inviting admiration without confrontation. Yet beneath this apparent stabilization, something unresolved remained, because Bardot's life resisted the clean arc that history prefers. In academic and cultural circles, a more deliberate reassessment began to take shape. Scholars revisited her impact on European cinema, not merely as a star, but as a disruptive force. Bardot arrived at a moment when female characters were still largely defined by restraint or moral consequence. Her screen presence changed that grammar. Desire no longer required punishment. Sensuality did not need justification. She embodied a form of agency that unsettled filmmakers, censors, and audiences alike. In this sense, her influence extended far beyond the films themselves. She altered expectations. At the same time, historians emphasized how narrowly that freedom was framed. Bardot's liberation existed within a system that still profited from her exposure. She was celebrated for breaking taboos, yet tightly managed by contracts, publicity machines, and male-dominated structures. The freedom she symbolized was real, but incomplete. This tension, many argued, explains much of her later refusal to compromise. Once she recognized the limits of a role she had been assigned, she rejected it entirely. Her withdrawal from cinema, once seen as a scandal or eccentricity, gained new clarity in this light. It was not simply burnout. It was a refusal to age within an image that no longer belonged to her. Long before conversations about autonomy, consent, and exploitation became mainstream, Bardot acted on them instinctively, if imperfectly. She left before the industry could redefine her again, before nostalgia could trap her in a diminished echo of herself. The second half of her life, dominated by activism, complicated this narrative rather than completing it. Her defense of animals was unwavering and sincere, yet often expressed through language that alienated potential allies. Critics struggled to reconcile the compassion she showed toward animals with the hostility embedded in some of her public statements about people. Supporters argued that her absolutism was consistent, not selective. Detractors saw hypocrisy. What neither side could deny was her refusal to moderate herself for acceptance. This refusal is perhaps the most consistent thread running through her life. Bardot did not adapt to shifts in public expectation. She did not evolve in a way that reassured audiences. She remained fixed in her convictions, even as the world around her changed. For some, this rigidity diminished her. For others, it made her one of the last figures unwilling to negotiate identity for relevance. As her story settled into documentaries, retrospectives, and biographies, a subtle shift occurred. The focus moved away from judgment and toward inquiry. What kind of psychological cost accompanies early myth-making? What happens when admiration becomes ownership? How does a person reclaim themselves after being turned into a symbol? Bardot's life became a case study not only in fame, but in resistance to it. Younger generations encountering her now meet a fragmented figure. They see the beauty first, then the rebellion, then the retreat, then the controversy. There is no single entry point, no agreed interpretation, and that fragmentation may be her most enduring legacy. She cannot be simplified into a slogan or confined to a single chapter of cultural history. She exists as contradiction, unresolved and therefore instructive. In France, this complexity has prompted a more cautious approach to memorialization. There is respect, but not sanctification. Recognition, but not absolution. Bardot is acknowledged as a force that shaped the country's image abroad and its internal debates at home. At the same time, her refusal to align with evolving social consensus ensures that she remains uncomfortable to celebrate without qualification. This discomfort, rather than diminishing her, keeps her relevant. Internationally, her legacy continues to drift toward iconography. Posters, fashion references, and cinematic homages circulate more easily than nuanced debate. Distance softens edges. The farther Bardot travels from her original context, the more she becomes a symbol again, rather than a person who fought against symbolism. This irony would likely not have pleased her, but it is difficult to escape. Myths regenerate when removed from friction. Yet there is something about the way her life ended that interrupts this cycle. The absence of spectacle, the lack of a final performance, the insistence on privacy, all resist easy consumption. Her death did not provide a closing image to replace the old ones. There is no definitive final photograph, no widely shared farewell moment. In a culture built on images, that absence matters. It creates a pause. That pause invites a different kind of remembering, not one based solely on admiration or rejection, but on recognition of cost. Bardot paid heavily for being early, for embodying change before society knew how to protect those who represented it. She gained freedom for others and lost much of her own in the process. She refused to trade silence for approval and paid for that refusal with isolation. As her name gradually moves from current events to historical record, the question she leaves behind becomes clearer. Not who Brigitte Bardot was, but what we do to those we elevate too quickly and abandon too conveniently. Her life does not offer closure. It offers warning. In the next and final part, that warning sharpens into a broader reflection on fame, memory, and the uneasy relationship between admiration and erasure that defines modern celebrity. As time continues to place distance between Brigitte Bardot, the living woman, and Brigitte Bardot, the historical figure, her story begins to illuminate something larger than biography. It exposes a pattern that repeats itself across generations of fame, one that rarely ends with grace. Bardot's life did not simply unfold under public attention. It was shaped, redirected, and ultimately constrained by it. Her final withdrawal, so often described as eccentric or extreme, reads differently when placed against the broader machinery that creates icons and then demands their permanence. Fame, in her case, arrived before consent was possible. She did not negotiate her transformation into a symbol. It happened to her. The cultural moment was hungry for a figure who could embody liberation without threatening power structures directly, and Bardot fit that need perfectly. Her image carried rebellion, but her youth and gender allowed society to consume that rebellion safely, at least at first. What followed was not freedom, but expectation. She was expected to remain desirable, disruptive, and available indefinitely. This expectation is the hidden contract of celebrity. Once an individual becomes useful as an image, they are rarely permitted to evolve beyond it. Bardot's refusal to honor that contract explains much of the discomfort surrounding her later life. She did not age into nostalgia. She did not soften into reassurance. She did not apologize for wanting distance. In a culture that rewards accessibility, she chose opacity. In doing so, she broke the unspoken rules. Her silence was not passivity. It was resistance. Each refusal to appear, each rejected honor, each closed gate at La Madrigue reinforced a boundary. These boundaries frustrated a public accustomed to access. They also protected something essential. Bardot understood, perhaps instinctively, that continued visibility would cost her whatever remained of herself. She chose preservation over participation, even when that choice was misread as hostility or ingratitude. The price of that choice was loneliness. Isolation was not an abstract consequence. It was a daily condition. As years passed, her circle narrowed dramatically. Human relationships became fewer, while animals filled the emotional space left behind. This has often been portrayed sentimentally or dismissively, but neither framing captures the complexity. Animals offered her a relationship without narrative. They did not care who she had been. They did not interpret her past. They allowed presence without performance. This preference unsettled observers because it inverted the usual hierarchy. Bardot valued the voiceless over the visible, the vulnerable over the celebrated. In a world that had used her voice and body as spectacle, this inversion was radical. It was also isolating. Advocacy, especially uncompromising advocacy, tends to harden boundaries rather than soften them. Bardot accepted that cost. What makes her final years particularly instructive is the absence of reconciliation. Many public figures seek narrative repair near the end. They issue reflective interviews, clarify past positions, or reframe controversies to secure a gentler legacy. Bardot did none of this. She did not seek to be understood more clearly. She seemed indifferent to being misunderstood. That indifference reads as arrogance to some, integrity to others. Either way, it was consistent. In death, this consistency disrupted the usual rhythms of celebrity mourning. There was no final redemption arc, no collective sigh of relief that everything could now be forgiven or forgotten. Her story remained unresolved, and that unsettled audiences accustomed to closure. The discomfort revealed an expectation rarely acknowledged. We want our icons to explain themselves. We want them to make sense of the contradictions they represent. Bardot refused that role. Her refusal forces a question that extends far beyond her life. What responsibility does a public figure have to those who consume them? And what responsibility does the public have to those it elevates? Bardot's life suggests that the imbalance is severe. Adoration is rarely accompanied by protection. Fame amplifies desire, but offers little shelter. When the admiration fades or turns, The individual is often left to absorb the consequences alone. In this sense, Bardot's ending becomes emblematic rather than exceptional. It illustrates the cost of being early, of embodying change before systems exist to sustain those who represent it. She opened doors that others would later walk through more safely. She absorbed the backlash that would later be diffused. Her silence, then, is not merely personal. It is structural. It marks the point where an individual refuses to continue serving a system that no longer serves them. As her life recedes into history, the temptation to smooth its edges will grow. Myths prefer clarity. They resist discomfort. Bardot resists myth-making precisely because her life does not align with moral simplicity. She was neither purely emancipatory nor purely destructive. She was human in ways that fame struggles to accommodate. In the final part, the focus turns to what remains after the noise has fully faded. Not the legend, not the arguments, but the enduring question her life leaves behind about visibility, ownership, and the quiet dignity of choosing when to disappear. When the noise finally recedes and Brigitte Bardot's name settles into the long rhythm of history, what remains is not a neatly defined legacy, but a lingering tension that refuses resolution. Her life does not conclude with consensus, and that may be its most honest ending. In a culture trained to categorize figures as heroes or failures, Bardot resists both outcomes. She leaves behind not an answer, but a question that grows sharper with distance. The temptation to simplify her story is strong. It would be easier to remember her only as the woman who liberated the screen, or only as the provocateur whose later years generated discomfort. But either version diminishes the reality. Bardot was both formative and fracturing, both admired and resisted, both empowered and deeply wounded by the attention she received. To choose one version over the other is to repeat the same act of reduction that defined her public life. Her story invites a deeper reflection on the nature of visibility. Bardot became famous not because she sought to explain herself, but because she embodied something people wanted to see. Once she no longer wished to be seen in that way, the world struggled to accept it. Her refusal to continue performing her own myth challenged a fundamental assumption of celebrity culture, that once someone belongs to the public imagination, they must remain accessible to it. The final silence was not an erasure. It was a statement. By leaving without spectacle, Bardot denied the culture of consumption its final product. There was no curated farewell, no emotional crescendo, no last confession designed to tidy the contradictions of her life. In that absence, audiences were forced to confront their own expectations. The discomfort many felt was not about her death itself, but about the loss of control over how it was framed. What remains now is an image that cannot fully stabilize. Bardot exists simultaneously as memory and disturbance. She continues to provoke questions about autonomy, consent, and the cost of early myth-making. Her life illustrates how easily admiration can slide into possession and how violently systems can react when that possession is challenged. For those who came after her, especially women navigating visibility, her trajectory offers both warning and groundwork. She broke barriers that others would later move through with more support, more language, more choice. Yet she also absorbed the full force of a system unprepared to protect the individuals it elevated. Her withdrawal, often misread as bitterness, can be understood instead as an early assertion of boundaries in a world that rarely respected them. In this sense, Bardot's life continues to speak precisely because she refused to explain it. Her silence demands interpretation rather than passive admiration. It asks viewers, readers, and audiences to examine their own role in the making and unmaking of icons. It asks whether we are willing to accept complexity without demanding resolution. As time passes, her image will likely continue to circulate, softened by distance, stylized by nostalgia. Posters will fade into decor. Film clips will be rediscovered by new generations. But beneath those familiar surfaces, the unresolved core of her story will persist. The woman who refused to be reconciled with her own legend leaves behind a legacy defined not by answers, but by insistence. Perhaps that is the final truth of Brigitte Bardot. She did not seek peace through approval, nor meaning through explanation. She chose, again and again, to step away rather than submit. Her final disappearance was not an escape, but a conclusion consistent with a life spent resisting containment. When we look back on her now, what we see depends on what we are willing to confront. If we want comfort, her story will disappoint us. If we want clarity, it will resist us. But if we are willing to sit with contradiction, with the uneasy space between admiration and critique, then her life offers something rare. Not a moral lesson neatly packaged, but an invitation to reconsider how we treat those we turn into symbols, and what it means to let them go when they choose silence. In the end, Brigitte Bardot did not belong to the world, even when the world insisted she did. Her final act was to reclaim that truth quietly, firmly, and without asking permission.